So for those of you that have to drop or have more information to go back to and reference or aren't here, welcome to the ones that aren't here. There's definitely a handful of you there. So you'll have the information to go back and be recorded and watch later. So sometime tomorrow, can't say exactly when because it usually depends on my mornings, I will send out the recording. So if you don't have the recording, don't see it in your inbox by Wednesday morning, check your spam and also check any other things. And if you don't have it, email me and I'll send you another copy of it or whatever else. But most people that are not seeing it, it's somewhere in their spam or they have some mail filter set up or whatever. But be looking for that. It'll be coming out tomorrow along with the workflows, a couple of the sample images we're going to go through and a wide variety of other things. So that'll be coming in. All the presentation slides we're going to go through will be in that as well. So good stuff in there. So, all right. Well, let's start the share. And we're gonna be in PowerPoint for a good chunk of time, and then we'll be over in Photoshop and Lightroom for the last little bit. So it's about a 2-hour class, I'm thinking. So, and that includes questions. So plenty of opportunity to go through. So sharing the screen over there, and then starting the presentation. This one here, and I'm going to keep the chat up. Okay, so a couple things, housekeeping, so to speak. The idea is to put questions, very specific questions or things you just want me to see into the Q&A, and I will go into the Q&A. I have that open. I'll be able to monitor that one as we go through. General things or comments in particular are just kind of more generic questions that sometimes other people can answer. You can put those in the chat. So there's really no right or wrong. I would advise if you definitely want your question answered to put it in the Q&A. We'll get there. So a couple things on this. Gosh, excuse me. So one thing is with this many people, it's really difficult to have people ask questions live. But definitely as we get towards the end of the process, you can ask questions live. You just have to raise your hand and I can unmute you if you want to do so. Otherwise, take full advantage of the chat and the Q&A to put the information in there that you'd like questions. I'm going to try, last time I taught with this many people and such a great subject was on the print subject. So what I'm going to try to do is answer questions kind of in batches. Last time I had a period of time where I answered a bunch of questions and I think I kind of, we lost a little bit of momentum. So I'll probably answer in batches. So if I don't answer your question and when I stop, know that I'll come back to it and answer it later as we go through. So we'll be able to roll from that regard. So let's get going. Let's talk about finding our focus. So for those of you that don't know me, we have some newcomers that have never taken a class, some new signups. We have some individuals as well that may have not seen me before. You know who I am. My name is Nick Stover. I'm a full-time professional landscape photographer based in San Luis Obispo, California. And as a full-time professional photography educator, also photographic artist from time to time, you could say, I have a mission, and that is helping amateur nature photographers who are interested in deeper connections create more impactful images so they can confidently and consistently express themselves. And when I talk about the development of this mission, this wasn't just something I sat up on a high hill and thought, oh, this would be a great mission. This came out of working with a wide variety of people from all over the US, different skills and backgrounds and interests, and really an understanding of what we're going for most of the time as creatives or in our photographic journey. And that is a desire for a deeper connection to ourselves and what's going on, a deeper connection to our natural environment and what's happening there, deeper connections with other individuals, whether they're photographers or non-photographers alike. So the connection piece, I think we all share, and we all have different reasons at different times. The idea, though, is we want to be able to express ourselves by creating these impactful images. So in creating impactful images, well, there's two parts that kind of go into that: confidence and consistency. So we can all take the lucky image from time to time, but the idea of being consistent in our work and what we bring out is what a lot of what today will bring, because there's a lot of challenges as we get into focus, and there's a lot of things to consider. So all of you, regardless if you're a newcomer or somebody who's been doing it for a long time, has plenty of images within your repertoire that are just out of focus. They don't completely correct or communicate what you're going through. are going for within your images. And what is happening is probably one of these variables didn't align or something else didn't happen. When I talk about these variables, I'm talking about what I call, well, I guess, my 8 areas of focus we're going to talk about today. And as we go through this presentation, we're going to be really highlighting as we go through and as we talk about these things from camera focus points. We're going to look at the different types of actual focus methods that our cameras have, regardless of your Sony or Nikon or Canon. A lot of my stuff is set up specific to Nikon. I am a Nikon shooter, but most of the stuff where I could bring information in, I try to for other brands, but chances are you can Google it, or they're all pretty similar in that regard. So we're going to talk about camera's focus point in terms of where we're telling and how we're telling the actual camera to focus. The next thing we'll talk about briefly or show about is the concept of depth of field. And I'll explain with some graphics what depth of field exactly means, because it's a little bit of a vague thing. We'll talk a little bit about hyperfocal distance in here as well. We're going to also look a lot about in-field techniques. There's a lot of in-field techniques I utilize, whether I'm on a tripod or I'm hand holding, and things I'm just constantly, consciously keeping in mind as I'm working a scene. Then we're going to look at some of the technical settings on our cameras. What should we be setting? What should we be operating to really maximize the best portion of our images to kind of bring forth everything you need? Excuse me. Frog in my throat today. Sorry about that. Take a drink of water. Hopefully that helps. All right, so the technical settings on the cameras. Then we have post-processing techniques. What kind of things are we going to want to do in post-processing to really help our focus? So I'm going to show focus stacking. I'm going to do this thing that I call synthesized long exposure, where we can take a bunch of images handheld, and I'm going to show you how to combine those together to simulate or bring out the long exposure look within images. But also post-processing things, I'm going to briefly demonstrate Topaz and how that can work to really sharpen your images up. I'm going to talk about sharpening as well. Then we're going to look at post-processing sharpening. I guess post-processing techniques are actually different, than post-process sharpening. Equipment selection, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, but I'm going to talk about this because it is a key thing to understand that goes into it. So sometimes I'll get photographers that have really basic entry-level cameras, which are great for us to learn the craft, but they're trying to produce these incredible night photography images that just don't quite get there because of the equipment that's been selected. And so there's certain things we can do that we can select to help us. And then the final one is practicing good hygiene. And I'm not talking about showering or anything else. I'm talking literally about lens hygiene and camera hygiene. I got some tips I'll show you out within there. So with that on focus, well, let's start kind of just, I don't know, maybe the basic parts of it. This was an interesting one for me. So many people, well, most of us, most of the time are going to look through our viewfinder to size up a scene. So regardless of if I'm going to take my final image in my live view on the back of my LCD, I'm almost always at some point in time or frequently going to be looking through my viewfinder. It helps me to see the scene more cohesively. I'll oftentimes really dial in on the part of my image with that, using the compensation, using the actual framing, and then the lens compensation in terms of the focal length, etc. So what is occurring, gosh, really, that's frog, is the diopter. And what I noticed on one of my newer cameras is the diopter usually comes out from the factory or whatever, and it's really kind of attuned to my eyes. Maybe as I've aged or something else has occurred, or just simply the diopter there was not in focus. So as I was looking through the viewfinder, my images were out of focus. And so I had to adjust my diopter. So it's a small dial on the back of a camera. It doesn't really matter what kind, whether it's a Nikon or a Canon or a Sony. You're going to see this little diopter control. And the diopter control will help to have things in focus. And so sometimes this is a really difficult lever or knob to kind of turn to get things a little focused. But do think about the diopter. The other thing about the diopter, I don't wear glasses for photography. I do wear glasses for night driving. But I've also been told that people that photograph through glasses have issues with diopters and they need to make those adjustments. So that's kind of the first thing to start with from the standpoint as we go through is the diopter and just kind of dialing in. It's very basic thing to kind of help or tweak ever so slightly. So if you're looking through your viewfinder, it's not feeling, well, there's a little tweak to do on the diopter as we go in. The next portion is where things start to get a little bit more complicated. And these are all, I don't know. I just had somebody in chat, Mark said that I'm freezing. Is that happening to other people or just him? Yes. Oh, okay. Let me switch Wi-Fi. It's not someone. Okay, we have a mixed thing. You are freezing. Okay, let me switch real quick to a different. I have two Wi-Fi. Let me switch to this one. Okay. And some people said it was fine. Other people said it was jumping. May not be my Wi-Fi. Maybe good old Zoom. But we'll see if that's any better. Any better so far? Yes. Thanks for letting me know. So far, yes. I'm just going to keep rolling. So if it gets really bad, then we'll. Well, that's funny. The people that have said it's fine for them are the ones that are actually closest by here on the West Coast. So Chris is like an hour and a half away from me. So that's interesting. Anyway, so I'm going to keep rolling back into it. But thanks for letting me know. And if it freezes up again, I could reboot Zoom or whatever, but hopefully it'll work its way out. So camera focus modes. And this is where it doesn't really matter. Each one of the camera companies is going to throw a slightly different jargon at this. They're going to call it different things, whether it's 96 points or 56 points or whatever else. But the camera have multiple focus modes to be considered out there within what we're looking to do. So these 7 focus modes are the 7 focus modes that the Nikons have, for example. So whether it's single point of focus or these little squares or the multiple point of focus, that doesn't really take a look at, or excuse me, doesn't encounter all the parts and pieces within there. So we have all these different focus modes, but what ones do we want to use and why in particular scenes? And here's a chart. You'll get a reference to these charts going forward. So you'll get this one. This is the out of focus modes for Canon on the right, the ones on Nikon on the left. So you'll get all these slides and be able to go through them later. And they're going to explain when and why you want to use all of these different focus modes. And so for my purposes, for the landscape purposes side of me and the nature side, but not the wildlife. So let's keep that completely separate. There's 2 different things. You can basically take anything where you're photographing a stationary object as one part of nature photography. And then anything where you're photographing something that is a moving object as a second type of nature photography. So you have stationary and moving. So those are the 2 biggest ways to think about focus. And what we're going to look about is there's these AF focus modes, autofocus, with AFC and AFS are the 2 most prominent ones. And what these are, so Canon calls this one, so this is the changing focus on the fly, which I'll show you or tell you how to do. But the AFS mode is single servo AF on Nikon or one shot AF on Canon. Couldn't find information on what it was for Sony's, etc. It's used for stationary subjects that do not move. And so it'll switch, you can switch between these different modes very, very easily. But if you're photographing natural landscapes like mountains or whatever else, you're going to want to be in AFS mode. If you're photographing things that are continuous servo, think continuous, always moving versus singular focus, well, you're going to want to be things that are moving subjects are going to be AFC mode. So AFC is continuous. And so that's things that are going to focus within there. So the way to change this really, really quickly, and you can look it up for your particular camera model or just type it in, how do I change focus? Well, on Nikons, they have a little button on the left-hand side. And this is where you can switch between autofocus and manual very, very easily. But if you push the button down, there's a little thing on the inside of it, which I can kind of zoom in a little bit here, and you can see if you push that button down, well, then you can just switch your back of your little thumb thing will switch you between those 2 particular modes. So that's a key thing to understand. You can be in AFS, but all of a sudden bird comes into the scene or the situation and you want to change, well, it's going to help it to focus in this regard, so you can kind of really quickly change into that particular type of mode. So AFS and AFC. So that's the focus mode, but then these are the focus points. And so the same thing goes, you can hit the same button on that left-hand side and then do the front wheel. And you can switch between the continuous focus modes or focus points within the image. So for me, and I'm going to talk about this here in a second, landscape photography, things that are not moving, I'm always in single point focus. And what that is doing is I'm telling the camera exactly where I want it to apply, to use the contrast and to apply the focus, where I want the lens to be the most in focus within my image. So that's why that makes sense for me. But if you're photographing something like wildlife or moving kids or sports or something else, you're going to want to be in one of the multi-focus points within here. And there's a lot of different articles that talk about the different pros and cons of these. I'm not going to go super into it, but you're going to want to be into a multiple focus mode. And what the multiple focus modes, it doesn't mean more of your image is going to be in focus. And that's the thing people think. Oh gosh, well, it's going to be more in focus if I'm in a multiple point mode, and that is not what's occurring. What is occurring is it's measuring the contrast, or the average contrast within the image. So if your subject is moving within the image, then it's going to be able to track the multiple focus points within there and keep that contrast point in focus. So think of face detection or think of other things within there. It's going to be able to focus those in there very, very carefully. And so this is why it's so great for wildlife. So if you ever zeroed onto a bird in flight and put it into a focus mode and then held it, you'll notice these little things, these little trackers will be tracking the focus, and it'll be shifting it around as the subject moves within your screen. So be thinking about your focus modes within there. If in doubt, in my case, I've had plenty of opportunities where wildlife has come into my scene and I'm in single point mode, which all means is I have to adjust my focus sometimes a little bit more manually than if I was in one of these continuous modes. So that's the type of focus points and the focus modes within the cameras. So something to keep in mind on the cameras in terms of that. And then I'm going to talk about how to do more zooming on the camera, and then we'll take a quick break for questions and then roll on to the next portion. The next thing, or the other thing I absolutely recommend changing, is changing your camera to back button focus. And so what happens oftentimes, and I see it time and time again, is if we have your camera set up where you detach or lightly touch the shutter button, sometimes you can use it to bring it down just a halfways will bring that image into focus. Well, what happens is then people depress that button when it's on a tripod or something else, or in night photography or low light scenes or anything else, and they completely lose the focus and they can't hold the focus point. When you're using back button focus, AF on, that's set up, and you can set it up on very easily to be able to go through, or you can customize other buttons on the back of your camera as well to have back button autofocus. What that means is I can hold back button focus as I'm tracking or bringing a part of the image into play or whatever else, and then I get my focus exactly the way I want it. Then I click the shutter button and it takes the image. And so that's really cool because I'm not hitting the front button and then it kind of bringing the focus in or out. I'm holding the back button and I'm able to bring that in focus, and I'm able to bring my images into focus much, much quicker. Pop it up, hit the back button focus, I'm in focus. Then when I hit the shutter, it takes the image, it doesn't focus and then take the image. So if you do have an AF on button, you're going to want to check your settings, and here's some of the information on that to make sure it's just AF on. And so I sent my camera back to Nikon a couple of years ago. They had to do a full factory reset on some things to update stuff. And when it came back, I didn't check this. And I'm out there in the field and I'm having all these focus problems. And I'm like, what is going on? This camera, they broke it, blah, blah, blah. And then I thought, I'm wondering if they have it set up for both. And that's the factory default for most cameras. So if you're hitting the shutter or you're hitting the back button, it's going to be focusing in both regards. So you want to have one or the other, not both of them usually. Usually it's going to be back button focused. The other thing people are going to say is, I don't have an AF on button, and I've seen that. I had a D7200 for a while, didn't have an AF on. Well, you can program the AE L or the AFL button, or there's usually one and the same, which is the depth of field simulator, to make that button your activating of focus. So keep that in mind. So if you don't have an AF on button, you can program that button to become your back button focus within the situation. So I love back button focus. The other thing I like within the camera itself is also live view zoom. And this is a really cool thing to be able to set up. So the Canons and the Nikons, both of them, and I'm once again not too sure about Sony, but I'm sure they all seem to follow each other. You can change it. So you're in live view right here. And if there's a particular part of the image that you want to check that's in focus, you can set up this multi-selector center button, which is this one right here, to zoom in automatically for you. Because the issue we run into oftentimes is when we're out there in the field and we're trying to zoom in and check the focus, well, we're hitting this button over on the left and then hitting the button down below to zoom in and out and move around, et cetera. It's a major pain. So for me, if I really want to check my focus in live view, I'm going to zoom, I'm going to have the image the way I want it. Then I'm going to hit the button and either go to high magnification 200, or even sometimes just a 1-to-1 works. I think mine's actually set up to go to 200 now. And then I'll be super zoomed in on that area. And then I can fine tune my focus to be pinpoint accurate on those particular parts of the image. And so that's a key part of this. Within live view, I can now see my image and zoom super into it to be able to make sure that part of the image is really sharp. So sometimes that could be a really far away peak out there in the distance, and I want that area to be really sharp. The thing about using live view zoom, so I hit that center button, it zooms in, I hit the center button again, it zooms back out, it's great. This is something that's very difficult to do handheld. So if you're going to be using live view zoom, you're going to want to be using a tripod to do that, because then you can fine tune your focus ring ever so slightly and kind of adjust your focal length or do anything else very finely. So that's the big part of it. Question came in even before we got going, which is a great question. If I'm using live view zoom, should I be using my reading glasses? And I would say the answer is yes. So if you're using live view zoom, should you be using your reading glasses? I would say you should, but you could also experiment and see. With that zoom functionality, and I'll talk about another way to check your zoom as well, you may not. It may be able to bring it into enough focus for your eye, but if you're taking the image or you're looking at it, I just do a simple compare and contrast within there. So that's a good question. So a couple questions that came in. It's a great point to pause before we move into depth of field and think. Somebody asked about Milky Way in the sky. I'm going to talk quite a bit about that. Laura asked, can you please talk about where or how to focus when there are a group of subjects, like a bunch of birds, not sure what to do? So when we talk about something like that, this is going to be the camera focus modes that you're going to want to find. And what I'll do, Laura, is the follow-up that'll get sent out. I lost my paper for now. I have a notepad. Where'd it go? I will send out an article on the focusing. It's from Photography Life that talks about it, and it'll show you exactly for which types of scenarios you're going to want to do that for something like birds, because they gave the example of birds. So I don't do a lot of bird photography or much of any actually. That you're going to want to use one of the AF continuous modes or the multi-point, but then there's other considerations in terms of which one you want to be in focus. And that's the thing that the camera focus points can make that decision for you or help to make that decision within there. So, which is good. Good question. Somebody asked, how does the camera decide what is the subject to be tracked if you're using AFC with multiple focus points? It will use oftentimes some type of face detection or eye detection in terms of the subject. So that the big hubbub that's out there right now is the new Z9 from Nikon, and just how advanced the facial detection is within that and how many frames per second it can photograph. So that actually has some of that technology built in there that's really good for face or subject detection. So that's some of the focus mode portions of it too, which can kind of help all the way through. So yeah, that's a good question. But yeah, it'll help to put into focus exactly what you're trying to do, because it can kind of separate subjects just ever so slightly. Another question came in, and then we're actually going to jump back in, which is great. Do you always shoot in RAW? And the answer is absolutely. I didn't cover it in this presentation, probably because everybody that's been from my other ones has gotten. Oh my God, I just realized I didn't have my microphone down in front of me either. So no, that's probably a much better quality now. Jeez, amateur hour today. So I can tell you probably everybody that's been at my other classes, people are going to have to turn their volume down because it's actually real good quality now. Thanks, Ed. Should have had me covered. The port of it is RAW is absolutely vital. And if you're in an earlier version of Lightroom, I don't have an official relationship with Lightroom. I would say to spend the $10 a month to upgrade. It is really worth it. So it's $120 a year. They're constantly rolling out new features, but Lightroom and Photoshop in this day and age are designed to work so well together that you can really use them interchangeably. And I think you're going to see pretty dramatic improvements in your images as you go through. So, all right. So now we're going to talk. Yeah, I'm glad I got the mic back too. I had it. So funny story about the mic. For some reason I had in my head 4 o'clock today. So I sat down at 3:55, got everything all dialed up. Was ready to go, had the microphone all set, and was like, all right, ready to go. And then logged in and nobody was there. And I'm like, that's really weird. And I checked the clock. It was like, oh, 4:30. So I guess put my mic up in the half hour. I forgot to take it down. So sorry about that. All right. So let's roll into the next part. And the next part's going to be, what we're going to talk about that, is going to be depth of field. So understanding the exposure triangle, which is the balance of aperture, shutter, and ISO, which we'll talk a little bit about those particular ones, is the concept of really understanding depth of field. And so we can talk about this in different regards, like this one from ShotKit. I like this diagram recently that really shows the concept of shallower depth of field versus the more depth of field and what we're trying to bring into focus. So really understanding this concept is going to help you quite dramatically in how you process your images, how you capture your images within there. So if you're out there, this is you, Mr. or Mrs. Photographer, your depth of field, you're out of focus. What is out of focus within the scenes and the situations? And so if you're using a very open depth of field, well, the camera itself is going to blur, the lens is going to blur those things that are out there within the distance. And so if you're going for a more artistic effect of actually having the flowers in focus, in this particular case, as we can see here with everything else out of focus, well, that actually works. Or something that's a more kind of, I wouldn't say moderate depth of field, but F4-ish, F5, well, maybe you'll have more of the actual bear itself with the flowers in focus, but the mountains will still completely be out, versus a more depth of field. Maybe when we get down into F16, we're going to have everything pretty much in focus within the image. And we'll talk about what the downside of F16 is. But now we have the mountains in focus, the bear in focus, the flowers in focus all the way through. And what we're going to talk about when we get into this is the balance or the trade-offs we'll experience in the work. So the thing I tell people time and time again on Aperture is if you think you might want to make creative choices later to blur the mountains or blur the bear or whatever else, you can very, very easily do that in Lightroom or Photoshop. What you can't do later in Lightroom or Photoshop would be to sharpen up the bear or sharpen up the mountains to the point where you could see those again. So if in doubt, I always go for more depth of field, knowing that I can easily come back in later and blur out parts of the image if I wanted to, versus blurring out things early on. You can't bring back the sharpness at a later point in time. So I always err on the side of more depth of field. I'm going to talk about this now and I'll recap it again later. It's important. So when we look at lenses and we look at other things, the sharpest lenses are always going to be prime lenses. And when I say the words prime, those mean the lenses that are non-zoom. So a 50 millimeter is called a prime lens, or a 35 prime, or a 200 prime. And what you have is you don't have that zoom element. So the lens itself inherently will be a little more sharp. Some people can really notice the difference. Other people, it's not as bad, or you got to trade off between the zoom. Me personally, I like the zoom capability to have some flexibility in what I'm capturing as I'm moving within the landscape.
So thinking about that helps to determine a little bit of the optics. But for most zoom lenses, in my experience and talking to other professional friends of mine, f8 to f11 is going to be the sharpest your lens will be. So f8 to f11 is where your lens is going to be the sharpest. That means you're going to have a pretty good depth of field, but nothing like you'd see with an f16 or an f22. And I'll talk about them later what the downside is of f16 or f22. It's called diffraction. And I got an example of what this actually looks like. But keep that in mind as you're working the lens. And so if you're going for the optimal sharpness, and you can do tests to figure it out, you're going to be somewhere in there. The secondary part of the lenses, the zoom lenses in particular, is they're not going to be as sharp when they're fully extended as they are in that middle range. So that middle range, so if you have a 100 to 200 lens, for example, well, probably 120 to 170, 180 is going to be the sharpest part of that lens. And as you get into that upper fringes, you're going to lose a little bit of sharpness. Probably going to be a trade-off if you really want to reach out and touch that image all the way through, but just keeping those in mind. So that's the concept of depth of field. We're going to revisit this in a different way later on, but I want to go next to hyperfocal distance. So for those of us, well, I didn't learn hyperfocal distance. I learned how to focus a completely different way. And I'll come back to this, but I'm going to show you there's actually charts that you can reference that will tell you or help to guide you based on your focal length, based on your aperture, based on your camera, where you should be focusing within the image. And this is really relevant and really interesting considering how we can change different lenses or how we can change different cameras, et cetera. So PhotoPills, that is the best $10 you can spend. One time, $10. They have all the hyperfocal distances charts built into PhotoPills. So that's a really cool thing to have. So you can go in and you can plug in your camera model right away, and it'll tell you based on your focal lengths and your apertures what your charts would be. There's also, and I saw the question come through, am I going to send these charts? And the answer is no, not because I'm trying to hold them back, but the answer is there's so many different charts based on your focal lengths, et cetera. So if you type in hyperfocal distance charts, you're going to find exactly what you're looking for out there. So I can send them. You're going to get these slides, all of these slides we're going through, so you'll see them, but you're also going to want to fine tune them a little bit for what you're doing. And when we're talking about hyperfocal distance, as we're talking through it, well, what this is meaning and the best way to think about hyperfocal distance, there's a couple just general rules. And one of the general rules that many people will talk about is if you focus about a third of the way into your image, into your frame, or however you're going to look at it, into your image you're constructing, you're most likely going to have the hyperfocal distance you want within the image, taking your distance all the way back through. It's a good rule of thumb if you blank or if you just need to kind of focus, or gosh, I need to react quickly, to be focusing about the third of the way in there. But, and I put the buts in there, the reasons this changes so much is because if you're photographing with a wide angle lens or if you're photographing with a telephoto. And this chart in particular, I've looked at lots of hyperfocal charts that are just so painful to look at. I like this one. It comes from Miguel Mesquita. Never heard of Miguel Mesquita until I started putting this presentation together. I like this one because he does a really great job of showing exactly what the hyperfocal distance changes based on your focal length. So if you're photographing this scene in a wide angle, 24 millimeters considered wide angle, well, your focal distance is only going to be 2 feet. And it would put everything else into acceptable focus, kind of going backwards. So oftentimes when people look at my images, they think, wow, you must do a lot of focus stacking. The answer is no, I do a lot of wide angle shooting at an f16 that brings a lot of that into focus. Versus if you're doing telephoto landscapes, f16, 200 millimeters, you're going to be looking at a very far off focal distance, 137 feet. None of us are going to get out there in the landscape necessarily and measure this and check it out, but we're going to have to know if we're trying to get something really closely in focus, well, we're going to have to start to change some things around. So if these trees are fairly close to you and you want them to be in more focus, well, you can't be necessarily at an f16. You're going to have to be at a lower, more moderate f-stop all the way through. So thinking about hyperfocal distance helps you when you're framing up and you're looking at your scenes. The way I learned how to focus within the field goes back to live view. And so let's say I'm here, I'm at a 50 millimeter focal length on this particular scene. I'm wanting to capture some of these really interesting rocks, but I'm also wanting to see the trees kind of out there in the distance as well. So what I will do is going back to what I talked about here of live view zoom. So thinking back just a little bit, we're in live view. Now we're zooming in. I will take an image sometimes, or other times I will just look in live view. I'll get the focus I think is good, and I'll just start scrolling around within the image to check to make sure it's in focus. So I would focus somewhere like something like these rocks right here, put that into focus. Probably would take the image because it's sometimes easier to do that and then look at the thing and zoom around. Then if you bump your focus or something, you're not messing everything up. And I would start to zoom around. And if I'm having acceptable levels of focus on the trees back here or not there, that's going to make a determination on something like, do I need to focus stack? Or it's going to make a determination on something else of where I need to change my focus within the scene. So maybe I need to focus further back because this area gets into what's called infinity, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But that's the way I oftentimes check my focus within the field. I oftentimes within the field in a scene or a situation like this, I will be shooting something like an f16 to get more of the scene and more of that depth of field in play. I'd rarely in landscape photography are going to be shooting with a wide open aperture because if you're in a wide open aperture, you could have things in focus. But going back to what we talked about, so that shallow depth of field, we're going to have a lot more out of focus out there within the distance. So to take a look at that. So that's the concept of hyperfocal distance and depth of field. These are some of the charts you can reference and start to play around with a little bit. I wouldn't stress about it. I've had people super stressed out about hyperfocal things. Engineers, oftentimes, you guys really want to understand all the nitty gritty about it. And you could probably speak much more intelligently about it in your images and what it makes sense versus other people. We want to be out there and creating. We want sharp images. There's ways to check them, which we'll talk about some of the infield techniques and other ways too. Another good pause for a question. Mike asked, you want to take pictures of a painting, which focal depth would be best? And the answer is, I'm not sure. I can guess, but I'm thinking anything, if you're taking a picture of a stationary object, you're probably going to be in that F8 to F11 portion because there isn't necessarily that need for depth of field. And you certainly don't want to be blurring the outside portions. You want to be representing what's in place. So for those types of things, and there's probably people on here that do things like food photography or whatever else, I think you're going to want to be probably closest to your sharpest aperture, which is that F8 to F11, which is good. Will you place your focus point at the hyperfocal length? Yes. And so that's a good question. So yes, I would you could place your focus point because this is where it's kind of showing acceptable focus starts here. And then this is kind of the hyperfocal distance. And so, yeah, you could start to get that acceptable. I would be placing it right at the hyperfocal distance. So in this case, with that 50 millimeter lens, I'd be focusing right around there, which instinctually over years is actually where I would kind of know to be able to focus. I would actually look at a scene like this and most likely I'd be focusing right there because I know, well, it's about a third of the way into the scene. So 1/3. Maybe it's not quite, maybe this is about half, but that's about 2/3 in. This image is about halfway point here. So I would know kind of to be able to photograph right in there. So Shannon asked, I always thought you focus on what you want your eye to focus on, but that's hard with vast landscapes. It absolutely is. The concept of vast landscapes, which is an interesting thing, which I probably could have put in here, is how our eye actually sees the landscape. So we don't see the landscape completely sharp from start to finish or from front to back. We're going to see things kind of fall off as we get off into the distance. In particular, we don't see a full landscape. I'm looking out my window. I'm not going to be seeing the mountains out there in the distance as sharp as I'm going to be seeing the patio furniture that's directly out here in front of me. So thinking about that, and well, you never would want this part to be with a wide angle lens to be focused all the way up here, because then it's going to feel counterintuitive and really confusing as you go through. So that's the chart. Okay, so let's talk about some infield techniques. We're doing good so far. Appreciate the questions. Hopefully the technical issues, double technical issues. Geez, amateur hour, like I said. No, not a proper mic and Zoom issues, but I think we're over them both. So infield. So shoot with a tripod or from a tripod whenever possible. Yes, this is still a good rule, but don't stress about it. And I'm going to show a couple things as we go through and why. Go into live view, which locks the mirror up. So as you read or hear about, people are going to say, well, mirror up mode. Mirror up. You always got to go mirror up. And there's an actual button on the top that goes called MUP, mirror up. But when you go into live view, and you've all heard this sound, if they've ever gone into live view, you hear this click. And most people think, oh, it's my shutter or something else. No, it's actually the mirror. You don't get it in mirrorless, mirror going up. And when that mirror goes up, you're not going to get the mirror, the shutter slamming down, and that's going to help the stability of your images. So that's a reason from a tripod to be photographing in live view is your mirror is going to be up, which will improve the sharpness of your images. Use a remote shutter release when possible, or your camera timer. So I used to have a wireless remote shutter, a wired remote shutter. And then I realized, well, wait a second, if I have my camera on a tripod and I put my timed shutter on a 2-second or a 5-second release, I can just hit the shutter button, it'll wait 2 seconds before it takes the image, and then it'll take the image. So in that 2 seconds, my camera will have calmed down from my slight finger pushing and taken the image. The reason I also don't need to do this is an extra piece of equipment. I've seen plenty of people with their remote or their wired shutter accidentally drag their entire camera over, etc. So I found my images can be plenty sharp for night photography or whatever else by just using the camera timer delay. And you can set it up exactly you want, but 2 seconds, my lens is going to more than stop shaking by my little movement of pushing the button within there. The reasons to use remote shutter is for water. So if you're on a tripod and you're trying to capture specific water movement, like waves, you're going to want to be hitting the button and taking the image at that exact time. So be thinking about that. If shooting handheld, and I do a lot of my images are handheld, do not exceed 2x your focal length for your shutter speed. So if you're shooting at 28 millimeter, for example, you would not want to be any slower than 1/60th of a second. So this is something I kind of will keep in mind as I'm working the scene. So if I'm working a scene with my wide angle, my 14 millimeter lens, for example, I know I'm not going to want to go slower than 1/30th of a second on my shutter, or I might have some issues within there. So keeping this in mind is going to help. This becomes a big factor when we're doing long telephotos. That's why you go to Yellowstone and you see so many cameras on tripods. Well, because people are out 600, 800, 1,000 millimeters out. We're going to need to be at least 1/2000th of a second in that case if you're hand holding. Well, that's a really fast shutter in situations where you don't always get situations where you have enough light. So you want the maximum depth of field. So you think of your aperture closed down, you want to show the whole landscape. We have less light in there. You're trying to balance your ISO. So that's why being on a tripod with long focal lengths really, really work. So the questions came through. What if you're at 200 or 100? If you're at 200 millimeters, your shutter speed should be 1/400th of a second. 100 millimeter, 1/200th of a second. There's some rules that state you could be at the exact same shutter speed that your focal length is at. And I can say it's kind of getting into the marginal portions of things. So theoretically, you could be at 1/100th for a 100 millimeter focal length. I like to have the double in that buffer. It seems to make a difference for me. There's variables that are going to come into play that can help you a lot on this. So if shooting handheld, you're going to enable lens stabilization, and I'll show you how to do this if you don't, and in camera stabilization. So this is usually automatically enabled on the newer cameras, and this is going to push the boundaries of what you're going to be able to do a lot further. But this is where we're talking about the newer kind of higher end mirrorlesses. They're going to have the in-camera stabilization. So keep this in mind. So if you have lens stabilization and camera stabilization, they say you can pick up as much as 5 stops or more. So that's going to make a big difference. And when we're talking about stops, we're talking you could go down 5 stops. So going from 1/500th probably all the way down to 1/80th of a second. So you could slow your shutter down quite a bit and not have that. There's going to be some trial and error. No two photographers are the same. Some people are very kind of fidgety or kind of move around or hold cameras differently or whatever else. But these are some general rules I'll use. If shooting handheld, shoot in burst mode as well. So better chance of getting things in focus. So don't feel like you need to take one image at a time if you're shooting handheld, especially if you're cradling that camera, you're trying to get that bison as it's running. You should be firing away in continuous high almost the whole time, holding down back button focus and firing away. So for me, when I'm shooting wave photography, for example, it's the best example of this. I cannot be shooting on a tripod because I need to be able to sway and move in ways that the waves are going or whatever else. So I'm always handheld, which means I need a very fast shutter also to capture that movement. I want to be able to capture the moments or see things in there within the wave. So I'm always going to be handheld and I'm always going to be in continuous high. So I'll be shooting quite a bit, 8 frames per second, 8 frames per second, and holding down that button with my finger on the back autofocus on button. So this is where things all start to come together all the way through. So hopefully that helps. So somebody else said, I found squeezing the shutter release with the thumb at the camera bottom rather than pushing the release from the top induces much less camera shake. Oh, interesting. Found that squeezing the release with the thumb at the camera bottom rather than pushing the release from the top induces much less camera shake. So I don't know if they're doing it like this and pushing it with the thumb or like this with the camera bottom. Oh yeah, I guess I can see the stabilization. Yeah, so grabbing that camera and helping, but it's great. Okay, we're gonna keep rolling. So ways to focus your lens. One of the questions that came in early on, which is a great one. Help me focus my lens at night. This is the key. The number one thing to night photography, I'll tell you straight across, is how do you focus your lens at night? But the other thing that comes down to oftentimes is how do we focus our lens in dark scenes or situations where we can't get the autofocus to work. And you're like, oh, it always works, blah, blah, blah. Well, try to go photograph in mist. Try to go photograph in other scenes or situations where it's smoky or something else. And your camera is going to have a hard time with clouds or with waves focusing in all the time and getting things really, really accurate. So noticing or knowing for night photography in particular, this is a picture of my lens. I know that this little sweet spot right in the infinity of my 14 millimeter lens, there's the infinity portion. I kind of go into the middle portion of the 8 is my pinpoint sharpness for night photography. So people say, well, great, I don't have that, or I can't exactly, it's not exactly where it is. Well, the other thing you can do is get a little white, I don't have it here, but basically exactly like this, a white permanent marker or an oil marker. And you can mark it exactly on your lens where that focal point is. So if you do a lot of night photography, for example, as you get your focus ring where everything's completely in focus, mark it on your lens with a white pen, not like a regular ink pen, but a permanent marker pen. It'll eventually wear off over time, but you'll see it exactly there and you can line it up exactly where. There's other people that use tape. So maybe do tape and get those things to line up, but it's a really good way to be able to go in there, because the other 2 parts and pieces that are going to go in have different ways as well to focus. Well, we can use a loupe, L-O-U-P-E, not L-O-O-P. They're going to have links to all these ones in here. This one over here is from Hoodman. And this is designed for people that wear glasses. It's designed for really bright situations where it basically puts over the top of the LCD or the live view your own thing. It's $90. So it's not cheap, but it's not free by any stretch, versus the Carson loupe is $8. And I've used the Carson loupe to do or refine in live view my back of for my night images. And so I'll have my night images in live view, and I'll be zoomed in on a bright star, or kind of looking at a bright star with the loop, and then adjusting my focus ever so slightly. So using the loop, this little $9 thing, I'm making sure those stars are pinpoint accurate before I take the images. So loops are a good way to do this. Another good way to do this is to focus on an object. And there's two buttons I have shown here. The first is autofocus and manual on the side, for example, of a Nikon. So we talked earlier, we can hold this down to switch our focus modes. But this is also where we can quickly, so this is the front left of our camera, switch between manual mode and autofocus mode. So if we're photographing a situation, we get our focus dialed in the way we want it. We're going to want to go into manual mode, click into manual mode so our camera isn't constantly having to find it, and we can be taking the images. So I'll focus in on what my focus is, for example, with something like a seascapes or an ocean scene, and I'll go into manual mode so I'm not tweaking and modifying all the way through. The secondary thing, though, for Canons and other cameras is you oftentimes need to change your setting also on your lens to go from auto to manual. So you're going to want to take your autofocus on your lens to manual as well. So I have some lenses I have to double click. I have to go to manual mode on the lens and manual mode on the camera, and it'll keep it in manual mode. This is also the vibration reduction, which is on different lenses, which we'll talk about briefly in a second. So ways to focus on objects: autofocus in daylight, and then switch your focus mode to manual. You're going to see this a lot. So if you know you're going to be out photographing night scenes that are way out there in the distance, well, and you're not moving your camera, you can focus in daylight and then switch your mode to manual. And then when it comes into night, you're going to not. You can also autofocus on a distant light and then switch the camera mode to manual. So all the time, when we get that focus for night photography or for things that are way out in there or dim lights, we're going to want to put the camera into manual mode so it doesn't try to recapture that. Then you're going to be too instinctual on hitting the AF on button oftentimes, and you're going to lose that particular thing. Autofocus on the moon is another thing. And this doesn't always work for Milky Way photography. But if you're autofocusing on the moon, well, then you're going to be able to have everything else in scene, because that's going to be putting your lens at the optimal thing. But the other one, which I have used in slot canyons and other areas, is to shine the flashlight on a subject. So slot canyons can be really, really dark, even in the middle of the day. And I may be wanting a particular focus for a longer exposure, for example. And so I can take my flashlight, I can shine it on the wall where I want focus, then autofocus directly in on that. So flashlight left hand, autofocus right hand, get it exactly focused the way I want it, or fine tune it with live view, and then go into manual mode all the way through. So those really help to be able to focus on your objects regardless of your time of day. The other thing which I'll stress is to understand your lens components. Ignore everything else that's in here. It'll be vernacular you can look back to later of just everything else. But this is the distance, scale, and focusing range portion right here. Right here. So remember when I talked about your focal, if you're going to do hyperfocal or establishing exactly where things in focus, that's this thing right here. The view window, most good lenses have that in this day and age. This is obviously your focal length, but these two buttons over here are the ones you're going to want to look. So you have the manual autofocus switch, which I showed you. These are your vibration reduction controls. So active, if you're doing something like sports or things that are moving, or you're in a vehicle, you're on safari, you're going to want to be in active mode. You're going to want to have your vibration reduction on as well. There's different schools of thought, and I've read it both ways, that say turn off your vibration reduction when you're on a tripod. And I've had plenty of people say the new cameras, the new lenses today don't really matter. The idea is if the camera's on a tripod and the vibration reduction is on, it's going to be looking to stabilize more. I haven't seen the effect. It's a good practice to turn off your vibration reduction when you're on a tripod, because you simply don't need it. But I've also not done it and had images that were extremely sharp. So something to keep in mind. All right, so some technical settings. We're kind of rolling through stuff all the way through, and that's good. So keep as close to your base ISO settings as possible. Noise is a big part of images, which we'll talk about when we get into the Photoshop portion. Try to avoid shooting through a filter unless absolutely needed. And I say this in a couple different regards. UV filters, the only time I would recommend a UV filter is if you're out in a harsh landscape, blowing sand or a lot of blowing sea mist or something else. Otherwise, you're putting an extra lens element in there that chances are is not as sharp as your lens itself. So the only exceptions I also would say is circular polarizers are really good to bring out some of the contrast in the clouds in the sky or vegetation. But for the most part, I almost never have a filter on. A longer focal length equals faster shutter. Just think that kind of as you're going through or looking through images or out there in the field, man, even if you're on a tripod, well, if I was photographing this manually, what would I be happening? What would I be doing? So it becomes a little second nature. As I mentioned, f8 to f11 is the sharpest, but not the best depth of field. So many of you would say, well, my lens can go to f22. Why wouldn't I always photograph on that? And the answer is diffraction. So this image here, this has been corrected, quote unquote, corrected within Lightroom. But if you look at this over here on the left side, well, we have these vertical things called Thor's hammer that's supposed to be completely vertical. And yet it looks like it's about to fall over, just like this guy over there to the right. That's me. I should be standing completely vertically. I'm not that strong to be able to stand at a 22.5-degree angle. So we have diffraction. This image was captured at f22 to try to get the sun star within the scene. And I just happened to, oh, maybe I'll make it a self-portrait. Yeah, great. But not, and then I saw this image. I'm like, oh, this is perfect to illustrate diffraction. This was several years ago. And what's going on is we have the outside portions that are kind of leaning out, and you can correct it in Photoshop sometimes, but it's a pain. But the other thing that's occurring is if we look over here on the left, is this part of the image is really, really soft. And there's not, versus this part over here, really sharp. We have a lot of sharpness in the center part of the image. We have great depth of field. I mean, look down into the amphitheater and back out into the distance. We have excellent depth of field. And this would have been a great choice if I didn't have things on the side of the image. So if I was going to crop it down or whatever else, that's a good thing. So that's why I rarely will use f22 with something or a scene like this, but I will use it as we talk about focus stacking from time to time. So those are the technical settings. Now let's talk about in-field focus stacking. So these are the last few slides, excuse me, of the presentation. Actually, no, I added a couple more about lenses and hygiene. So we're going to keep rolling. We're in good shape. In-field focus stacking. The newer cameras, both the Canons, I don't think Sony has this yet. Canon and Nikon, starting with the D850 with Nikon, and I think with the R5, maybe even sooner for Canon, they have what's called focus shift shooting. This is really cool because the camera can automatically do the focus stacking for you in camera. So you can go into focus shift shooting. You can set up your number of shots you potentially wanted to take. I think I have mine still set at 100. It takes at maximum 10 shots for a landscape image, which I'll show you as we get into the processing. Focus step width, how much you want it to be in between intervals between shots. You should always have this at 0. Step width is a kind of a moderate between how much it's going to look within the image. You can read up on this stuff. Exposure smoothing, I would turn that on in my scene, and then silent photography as well. I turn that on in my camera as well. So it will automatically do this silently, and it'll take somewhere between 3 to 7 images, 3 to 10 images every single time I set this. So this is really cool because rather than have to mess around, which I'll show you in a second how to manually focus stack, it's going to automatically focus stack the image for me. And then I need to go back in to Photoshop, which I'll show you, and align the image and bring it together. Really like this. The other thing it does is it creates its own folder. And so when I'm going back through my images, I don't have to be like, when did that focus stack start or when did it end? I'm going to be able to see very clearly all the way through. Focus bracketing is what it's called within Canon. If your camera doesn't have this, I saw somebody put in there, Olympus has OME-EM Mark III has focus stacking. Great. If your camera doesn't have it, particular model, you can get the Cam Ranger. The Cam Ranger 2 is the new one that's out. I think they're like $160, give or take. It's a remote camera controller, and you can focus stack using the Cam Ranger, which is pretty cool. There's a whole bunch of other things it does. I know people that swear by the Cam Ranger's for a wide variety of things. I haven't personally used them, but it's definitely a way to go through all the way through that. So focus stacking in the field, you can have the camera do it for you, or, well, we can do it ourselves. And so the recommendations I have, so let's look at this image here on the left. And I've taught on this image before. I'm not going to teach on it today. This is Death Valley. And this one here, I'm shooting at a wide 14 millimeter focal length and focus stacking because of going back to my depth of field, my hyperfocal. I'm not going to be able to get the full scene in focus in one image. When you're putting something super close in the subject, this is inches away from my camera, you're not going to have that. So I'm wanting the whole scene to be in focus. When I manually had the camera do it, it was coming up with, I think it was about 6 images that it focus stacked through. But if I'm manually focus stacking, well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my hand up in front of my camera and I'm going to take a picture, which signifies I've started my focus stacking. So the next sequence in there is going to be my focus stacking all the way through my image. So that's the first thing I do. I have people that use flashcards. I have people that do other things, but I'm going to do that. And I'm going to start here. And in this image, I'm probably only going to have to do 3 or 4 focus points. So this is why we use that single image focus. I'm going to focus here, then I'm going to focus here, then I'm going to focus here, and then I'm going to focus on the dune. So 1, boom, move the focus, 2, move it, 3, move it, 4, move it, boom. So that's one way to do it in the field, and then I'll align them later, which I'll show you. The other way to do it, which actually works for most people most of the time, is you can be in continuous high and literally hold it down, especially if you're on a tripod, and then just twist your focus ring very slowly all the way through. And this will bring this all the way back into play. So question came in, good question. I missed what f-stop you're working in. This one here, I'm actually working in 16. So not to the degree of 22, but not the f8, f11, because I want that depth of field. The other thing is if I'm getting diffraction, which is probably, this isn't a focus stacked image, this is just a raw. If I'm getting diffraction, it's over in the edges of the thing where there's not a subject piece. I don't have a person or a major object. So I don't care quite as much as having the inner part all the way through, all the way really sharp. So something like this, I'd be focus stacking at f16, which is good. Question. What about ND filters? Yes, ND filters would be included in when I talked about the technical settings. If you're going to be using an ND filter, it's going to be softening your image already, which is okay. But just keep that in mind. An ND filtered image is never going to be as sharp as a regular unfiltered ND images all the way through, which is good. You said on twice about focus stacking setup, but your slide says off. Which is it? I'm not sure I understand that question. Oh, yeah. So this one isn't my actual, it's just this one here. I just took a screenshot off of Nikon's website. I didn't take one off my Nikon. So yeah, off. I would have exposure smoothing on in this case. I think that's what you're asking about, Doreen. And I would have silent photography. So I'd have these two on within the image. So. Okay, well, we're going to keep rolling. Equipment selection, understanding our limitations, which is a big part of the image. So understanding when we read our lenses, so the front of most lenses are going to tell you what the minimum focus distance of your lens is. So this one is telling you that any object that is inside of 0.82 feet, this is a macro lens, is going to be not in focus. And so most people think, oh, that's a pretty good focal length. Most of my, it's actually decent. So most of my camera lenses are going to be 12 to 18 inches for a wide angle to a moderate 28 millimeter zoom lens. So what that means is anything that's inside of 12 inches in that case is going to be out of focus. That's the minimum focus distance our camera lens has. But, and this is a big but, and understand this, and I'm going to show a couple examples. You have a working distance, which is judged by, and that's not what they're telling you. Your working distance is the distance between your object and the front of your lens. Your minimum focus distance, and I don't know why they do it this way, is from the back of your camera to the front of your lens. So understanding that is going to help you understand your minimum focus distance. And so having a ballpark, if you know this is 6 inches, well, that means you have 6 less inches you need to compensate for here. So working this scene here. So if I wanted this pill bottle to be in focus and I knew my focal distance was 12 inches, well, then I would need to be 6 inches back from that to be able to have it in place to work that. So working distance is different than minimum focus distance. So thinking about that. The other way to see this, and any of you that have played around with trying to take more intimate or abstract photos, is oftentimes your lens, as you're zooming in and out, will not hold the focus. And so if you're zooming in on something, you can't get the focus. Gosh, I can't get this thing to focus, blah, blah, blah. We'll back up just a hair. And what you can do oftentimes is you can back up and then you can zoom in. And so I'll back up from something, like literally pull the camera back or move back, and then I'll zoom in a little bit with my zoom, and then I can still get that object there, but it'll now focus it at that point in time. So thinking about that, and we'll take a couple questions after I show a couple examples. So this one here, this is from the trip I just got back from the Canadian Rockies. This is out on Lake Minnewanka. And this image here, so this is the camera physically resting on the ice to take this image. The camera is literally sitting on the ice, just inches or fractions of inches away from the lines that are leading into it. So what's happening here is we're greatly exaggerating these ice formations or the ice cracks within there, or the way it's kind of formed, to be able to really bring an interesting foreground in there. And so you're saying, well, wait a second, Nick, I can look at this image and I can see that you're not 6 or 12 inches away from these, you're right on them. And the answer is yes. So even with focus stacking, and I'll show you, there's parts of the image that are not in focus. The right parts of the image are not in focus. The diffraction, this is f16. No, excuse me, this is f22 because I want that full depth of field. These are not completely in focus. This lower part, definitely not in focus. But what is occurring is the areas I want in focus stacked, without a doubt, is this part. These parts of the image, the mountains, the clouds, that's all in focus. And there's enough strong focus in this image that it pulls you through the image strong enough that your eye can kind of oversee the parts and pieces of the side that aren't in as much focus. So rather than sit here and say, well, this is inside of my minimum focal distance, I know I have a strong enough foreground to kind of work our way through the particular scene here. So thinking about that really helps us to kind of develop different ways of photographing the landscape oftentimes and other things. So it was a pretty powerful lesson for me to see. Lens was a 14-24. So I want to be as wide angle as I can. Those wide angle lenses really exaggerate foreground textures all the way through. This mountain itself was huge, but with the foreground lens, it's looking, or the wide angle, it's looking much smaller, but it's actually kind of working out in the terms of the scene, which is great. Okay. So now we're going to talk about understanding your lens. This is the last section, and then we're going to talk about hygiene, and then we're going to look at post-processing techniques, which we're doing good. All right, so understanding our lenses. One of the companies I like, a DxOMark independent company, they test lenses for a wide variety of different things, so you can understand the sharpness if you're looking at things. They talk about their lens test parameters and how they test their lenses, so the technical people as well. But if you're considering two different lenses, it's a good thing to kind of run through DxO. It's free. It doesn't cost you anything to kind of see if one is sharper than the other. What's going to happen? Well, you're going to see these prime lenses are oftentimes going to score the highest, or things like the Zeiss, the Carl Zeiss, the optical ones that are, more money than I'm going to make in a year probably. So I'm going to work with that trade-off. But I found certain lenses, if I was comparing two, they're going to score better than other. And the other interesting thing about it, which is really cool that they're independent, is you'll oftentimes see them score things like the Sigma or the other lenses that are off-brand, quote unquote, off-brand high if they have really good sharpness. So it's not like they're taking money from Canon or Sony or Nikon to score only their lenses higher. So understanding your lens, but you can also fine-tune your lens. So I did this exercise with three of my lenses. I couldn't do this exercise with my telephoto because I couldn't get that minimum focal distance. That minimum focal distance was too far away for me to try to focus the lens, and I didn't really care all that much. But I did it with the other ones, and I used Focus Pyramid. So you can see this is Focus Pyramid, and all these will have the links, like $20 for this thing. And they talk through how to do it. You go into AF fine tuning options, and then you're shooting at a wide open aperture. You're focusing on the lens, as you can see in this particular case. And then you can examine the image and check the focus. And so what I saw on a couple of my lenses, there was nothing that actually needed to happen within the lens. As the lens as it stood right now was everything was in the level of focus I wanted. But I had a couple lenses, 2 lenses in particular, where in the wide angle portion of things or the telephoto, I needed to make some zoom adjustments. And they give you really good instructions on how to do this. I made some wide and some telephoto minor adjustments to the scene, and it brought the whole image into focus. And so I've been asked the question before, should I calibrate my lenses? And I said, wasn't sure, blah, blah, blah. I finally went through the exercise. I calibrated my lenses and I discovered 2 out of my 4 could use a little bit of tweaks and modifications. Have I noticed since then? I can't say for certain, but I did notice when I was playing around with these settings, how it was bringing the focus. The other thing I noticed is my 1 prime lens was definitely sharper when I did this. So it was a good exercise to understand the objects. So, and then the good hygiene portion. So practicing good hygiene, these are links to all the good ways to practice hygiene with some cost-effective microfibers. I think this is 50 microfibers for $20, big microfibers. These Kimtech wipes, I recommend them all the time because what happens? We get moisture on our lens and we sit there with a lens cloth and all we're doing is wiping that moisture around on our lens. We're not actually removing it. Lens cloths won't remove moisture. They're not designed to be moisture wicking. These Kimtech wipes are scientifically designed to not scratch scientific equipment, much less lenses. So I always keep a bag of these anytime I think I'm going to get a wet lens. And my process is I'll do a lens wipe, oftentimes to clean up anything that's dirty, salt spray or whatever, a Kimtech to clean up the moisture that's on there, and then I'll buff it out basically with a microfiber one. So that's a big part of this to kind of bring all the way through. The other thing is the rockets, these little pocket rockets or whatever you want to call them, rocket blowers. You can get the higher end ones, which are $17. There's an $8 one on Amazon that get really good reviews. These are great first steps for a wide variety of things. The biggest thing is rather than grinding sand or debris into our lenses, we can blow off that debris, and oftentimes we can blow off water. So I've had water on my lens. I've used the rocket blower to kind of bring it all the way through. Here's a full kit from Allutra that has the whole thing, everything from a sensor cleaning swab, you can do it yourself, to an air blower, to the lens cleaning pens, et cetera, et cetera. So people always ask, well, what do you recommend or whatever? This is a great kit. I think it was $29. That being said, I personally don't have enough guts to clean my sensor, but I do recommend it. So if you're shooting at a smaller aperture, you're really going to notice sensor spots oftentimes. So even a weather sealed camera where I don't even take the lenses off, I'm still going to get dust within the sensor. It's just inevitable. So I will every 12 to 18 months, I'll send my cameras back to Nikon. It's like $55. They'll clean the sensor and send it back to me. And I'm back off to the races. You can do it yourself to clean the sensor, but I don't have enough gumption. I'm gonna don't want to mess anything up. So that's the part. All right, so let's chat about post-processing techniques and what I'm going to show. We're going to go through. We're going to go focus stacking. We're going to go talk about image stacking for noise. I'm going to show you real quick on Topaz. I'm going to talk about watching for noise in our shadows. So keep the post-processing sharpening. I'll show this again. Keep your pre-sharpening in Lightroom or Camera Raw to the very lowest. This is absolutely crucial. And I'm going back right now and reprocessing dozens of images that I'm trying to reprint because I was sharpening in Lightroom. And then what was happening is as I got to the end portion where I needed to resize my images or I wanted to just do specific things, well, I'd already sharpened them. And so I keep my sharpening really, really low, my radius, my detail all the way down, and then I'll adjust my masking all the way through. So that's one thing. Save your sharpening for the last thing you do. It should be the last thing you do, whether you're going for web. And be careful of the clarity and texture sliders within Lightroom, and I'll show a demonstration on what those are. So real quick, You'll get the follow-up information. I announced right now some new classes. You'll get information on these. I'm going to do one in a couple weeks, Valentine's Day. We can spend part of Valentine's Day on working in Photoshop. Then I'm going to do a class in March on luminosity masks. We're going to get into these field to finish. Oops, this is a typo. This was actually not the right date. Sorry. Free classes on vision. We're going to do some stuff on post-processing, doing peer submitted or user submitted energy reviews as well. The other thing which I'll send to you tomorrow is there's two more parts to this module, which I didn't teach today. One is the technique, vision, and processing of nature scenes, and the other is before the camera, which are tools to help you plan and execute your scenes and your images much, much better. So I'll send you a code to be able to get those for $10 off. So only $7 to pick up those extra two classes, which will really help you all the way through. All right. So last couple questions, which are good. So do I use the Nikon 24-120? I don't. I use, well, my camera settings or setups totally changing, effective tomorrow about 3 o'clock when my new camera arrives. But I will use traditionally the 28-300 and the 14-24, which is good. Sarah said she's going to Yosemite in March. Woohoo! Hopefully you get some snow. Would I recommend the 70-200 or what would I recommend? Yeah, I would. The 70-200 is a great lens for Yosemite because you're going to want to be focusing in on literally different rock cracks and the way the mood is kind of moving in. So 70-200 would be an excellent go-to. The wide angle is more difficult to use because of how enclosed the valley is. I've seen some of my images that I've created over the years making halftone look too small, etc. But my 28-300 is definitely the one I've used the more. Bruce said the Cam Ranger is 350-400, so I was way under on that. But any recommendations for a camera that can accommodate the techniques in your lecture? Yeah, Mike, you maybe should email me offline and I can kind of help you specifically on it. The thing about a lot of the techniques, and I really appreciate the question, because the entry level kind of kit cameras are not going to allow a lot of what I'm showing or talking about. You're not going to be able to switch into autofocus mode very easily, etc. I also don't want to advocate breaking the bank on a lot of different things. So to give you a sense, I switched to the mirrorless, did an intro on it about a year ago. I started with the Z5 and I got a 24-200 lens with that. Z5 is a full frame mirrorless camera from Nikon, and I've produced some of the best images I have in my collection out of just that full frame Z5, kind of smaller one, which is really cool. So that's a cool thing to consider. That camera and lens was less than $2,000. So that's a definite recommendation where I can do most of the techniques or almost all these techniques on there, which is good. Iceland, ooh, that'll be fun. Any tips on Northern Lights? Yeah, wide angles for Northern Lights, actually, not the more zoomed in ones. And then the focus portions I showed you on Northern Lights are going to be really paramount because it's really difficult to focus on Northern Lights. And then photo pills. Yeah, so the Gaia, so this class called Before the Camera, I do information on photo pills, not super in depth. I will be teaching a class on photo pills. Mark my words, just on photo pills was good. So. And then, yes, you get a recording of this class, so which is good. Okay. So a couple more questions, and then we're going to go into, we got 3 more left, and we're going to go post-processing, and then I'll take what time's needed at the end for questions. Have I ever washed a lens cloth, or did I just move on to a new one since they're so inexpensive? Yes, I have washed my lens cloths before. I used distilled water. So make sure to soak them in distilled water and then rinse them in distilled water to wash them. But I've definitely done that before. I also oftentimes find it's easier just to move on. And then I put lens cloths everywhere. So I'll move on with new ones that are kind of in my camera bag, but then I'll take old lens cloths and stuff them into my parkas or into my vehicles or whatever else, because I always seem to need them, sunglasses, phones, whatever. With a non-removable lens camera, do you ever need to clean the sensor? And I don't know the answer to that question with a non-removable like a Sony RX10. The way you could tell is if you went down to your absolute narrowest aperture. So f22, 26, or maybe some lenses go to 32 or more. Took a photo of the sky, a bright surface of the sky or paper. And if you saw sensor spots on there, that would mean you would need to clean your sensor. If you don't see sensor spots, then you're probably in good shape. So, hey, Peter, he asks, lens hygiene and health, is it better to store lenses outside your camera bag when you have them at home? Or maybe it doesn't matter that much. Back to the lens hygiene and health, there's two things I'll say on this. One is if you're photographing in really cold environments, maybe like Myra asked about going to Iceland, really, really cold environments. You're going to want to put your camera into a big Ziploc bag when you come back into a sitting, especially if it's really humid. So what's going to happen is your camera and all the components are going to be really, really cold. And then you're going to be back in a heated environment and with a lot more humidity. And what will happen is your camera will warm back up. But then if you have it in a Ziploc, it won't let any moisture in. And so you'll sometimes even see the moisture accumulated on the back outside of the bag. And then as your camera's warmed up, maybe in 45 minutes, an hour or so, it's fine. The other thing I do is I keep those silica gel packs that come with, in pill bottles or whatever else, or come in packages. And I throw those in my camera bag. So I have a couple silica gel packs from time to time. I personally don't take my lenses out or my cameras out when I'm home, aside to clean them, but I feel like they're stored safely. The likelihood of myself damaging my camera equipment is more likely than if it's in the bag. So, which is great. All right. So that's the portions of this stuff. Great questions. We'll answer some more as we go through, but now we need to talk about, all right. So you'll get all these slides that are in here. We're going to talk about these different things within. I'll show you what else you're getting. So you don't care about that. You do care about these ones, and my camera's zoomed in. I'm going to move my chat and stuff over real quick. Okay, so this is zoomed in, so it's going to look really big. So you'll get this one, which is how to do focus stacking. This is the focus stacking sets, kind of a guidelines within the field. If you want to do panoramas, vertoramas, and then how to process these. So you'll find it's pretty simple how to process and stack your images. I'm going to show you how to do this within here, but you'll have the reference material there on that one. You're also going to get the way to create long exposures from handheld images or synthetic long exposures, however you want to look at it. I'll show you one of the images I took in Yellowstone, and how I created a long exposure image of it. So this will be one of the things you get as well. All right, so we don't need to see that. We don't need to see that. We don't need to see that. Okay, so let's look at the image blend. And so image blend here, moving this one aside. All right, so we got this image I captured here. ISO 320, so moderate ISO, f11, and then 1/160th of a second for the shutter. So I could have probably, for using my rules, I probably actually could have gone to a lower ISO on the camera. I could have gone to a good aperture here. I like the f11 choice. My focal length was pretty much set, which meant I could have gone probably one stop faster. I probably could have gone to ISO, I think it's 250 on this camera, and I probably could have gone one stop less on my shutter. I could have gone to 1/100th of a second and still had enough tonal value. All that aside, these are the images I took. So the way I took this image and then processed it. So I processed this image and I took these images. Let's go hit the I key. So 9:16, 19, watch my time up here. These ones are pretty much continuous as I'm firing as quick as I can. But as you're watching the images, you can see, even as me being as steady as I can or wanted to be or tried to be, the camera itself is actually moving around a fair amount within the image. We have a lot of water movement going on here. And if I was on a tripod, I wouldn't have any of this in terms of the camera side to side. But what we're going to do now is actually, so the way we would take this image next, we would highlight all the images we want to include. And I have 21 of them here. and I would right click and I would go edit in and then open as layers in Photoshop. It will take a little bit of time to load these images. So rather than you guys sit here and watch them do it, well, I've already loaded them in to Photoshop. And of course, Photoshop does not like to play well with the zoomed in screen. So come on. Sometimes does and sometimes doesn't work. And it's not working well for us. So I'm going to have to zoom out my screen real quick. Hold on. Going back to this one, display settings. Done. All right, now Photoshop's playing well with us. Okay, so now I have my Colonnade Falls right here. And so these are all of my layers loaded in there, and you can see each one of them is a little bit different. And so what I'm going to want to do is click the first and the last image, or the last and the first, doesn't really matter. And so what I want to do now is align the image. So I don't want to do that. I want to click up over here, and I'm going to go to image, file. I don't know, I'm working too many programs. Okay, edit, auto align layers. And I'm going to select auto for the projection of it. And it actually took away the other thing that used to be in there. There used to be one for seamless tones and colors, and I actually took it away, which is great. So I don't need to remove vignette or any geometric distortions because it's in good shape. But I'm going to auto project it, and I'm going to auto align the layers. And so what it's doing now is it's looking at all 19 or so of these files, and it's going through and it's going to be making these subtle adjustments to the image. And as we get to the end, you'll see. So what it's looking for is the areas basically within the image that are the realistic parts. It's not going to be looking at the water. It's going to be looking at things like the rocks and the trees, and it's going to use those to align and kind of tweak and modify the image ever so slightly. So you can see, luckily I have a fast computer. It's gone through and it's generated or aligned them. Now it's generating the panorama for us. So if you have, and you can see the output panorama has been generated, and we can look at any number of these, but you can see that as we turn on different layers, well, it's different things are being aligned within there, but we have excellent alignment now. Remember before we were going through and seeing a lot of different changes in shapes. Well, now we have exactly the alignment, the waterfall. The object's not moving, the water in itself is, which is great. So now we're going to go, and if we look at the workflow, the trusty dandy workflow. So we've done this, open as layers. We're going to align them, edit, auto align layers. We don't have to select seamless tones and colors because they actually deleted that out, which is a good sign. And then we're going to go to layer smart object, and we're going to convert them to smart objects. So we have this up in here, and up at the top, we have layer, and then we have smart objects, and we're going to convert them all. So we have them all selected into a smart object. And this is another one. Once again, Photoshop's going to kind of do its little dance, look through you. But what we're doing is we've now incorporated all these images into one smart object. And what a smart object means is all of these images that are down below. So if I actually double click this, maybe I didn't want to do that actually, because it'll probably take, I'm not going to do it because it might open up, it'll open up all the files, I guess is what I'm getting at. So if you double click it, it'll reopen up all of your layers that are down below, but I don't want to do that because of bogging down computer in your interest of time. So now we've done that. And then with the smart objects selected, go to layer smart objects, stack mode, mean. So now we're in here, we're going to go back over to layer, and we're going to go to smart objects. We're going to go down to stack mode. And when we go to stack mode, there's all kinds of different things we're going to check, but mean, kind of going back to the earlier days, is going to take the averages, which is probably slightly different than the median. And as we take these averages, well, now all of a sudden we've created a long exposure image. So in creating the long exposure image, we can Command Z it, or we can go back in and redo it all the way through. Well, now we have that long exposure thing. So this is a handheld image, and now we have that long exposure feel within the waterfall. But the other thing it's done is it's dramatically sharpened up the image. So this is at 500% zoomed in, which is way more than we'd ever need to do. I mean, we're talking, I usually go to 100% and look around this image. This is with the Nikon Z5, going back to that kind of entry-level full frame Nikon they have, and just how unbelievably sharp this image kind of all the way around and all the way through is. And so this is a way to blend together focuses. If I was photographing at high ISO with a lot of noise, like I do sometimes with night images, this stacking method will reduce noise as well. So now we have that final complete image, and we can kind of go about or do whatever we want to do within that. So now you know, if you're out in a scene, you're like, oh God, I really wish I had my tripod, whether it's a seascape scene or a river scene or a waterfall scene, try this. Is it as good as you would get with a tripod? Probably not quite as good. I'd probably want more consistency in the water, but you can play around with it. So you could actually do a bunch more. I actually took 60 images, I think, and you can do even more to have more of a silky wave or whatever else you want to look, but this is definitely a way to do it. So that's that portion. And now I want to answer questions before I show how to focus stack. So. Cool. I'm glad. Well, I got two of the more reliable guys, and Peter and Mark have been to so many classes liking that. It's great. So I'm glad you enjoyed that portion. And then any questions? So other Peter, would wind affect this stacking? I'm gonna actually move that over there so I don't block it. Wind would not affect the stacking. That's a great question though, Peter. And the reason that it wouldn't change your life, change the image, is it stacking off of something like the rocks. If you're doing something, let me rephrase, wouldn't change this stacking, but it could change other stackings. And when I talk about other stackings, it could be something. So if you're photographing something like flowers and there's a lot of wind coming through to do something like that, then yes, it would definitely change that. So if the petals were moving or the leaves, it could do it quite a bit in that regard. And then probably if we looked, if there was a lot of wind here, we could probably even see particular parts of the image, but we didn't really have much wind. The way we can correct this, if we needed to, so if we had an area over here where we were getting a lot, and this is way zoomed in, but if we had an area that was getting a lot of wind or something else, then you can mask in just that portion. So I've done that on other images. So maybe I have an area where there's a part that was really getting a lot of movement. Well, I'll mask in just an underlying base image for that, because really all I care about is this portion here. So cool. All right. Do you have a minimum amount of images you could use? I did this with 8 the other day, or a couple when I was in Montana. I did it with 8 and it looked pretty good. So that was it. But that was also, it depends on your shutter, depends on the lighting. This was a brighter situation where I was going with a really fast shutter. I probably would have had to do more images, but I tried it with 8 and it looked pretty good. It looked very similar to this one here. Okay. All right. Can you show us where you focused in this image? Good question, Ira asked. I can't tell you. I can't, there's an plugin for Lightroom, and I'm blanking on the name of it. If I can find it later, I'll send it to you, that can show you exactly where you focused. I would say, just my rule of thumb, I focused right here. I focused just to the left. This is the area I wanted I wanted this part to be in focus. So I focused over on a reliable, brighter part of the image. That's actually a great question. So I'm going to find something that's bright. I'm going to do my single image kind of on that point. And it's not going to make a difference when we get into this level of hyperfocal, whether it was here or here, all the way through. But by focusing here, well, then I have some of that depth. There's that partiality where you can see, or it feels like that part's a little bit further back, which is good. All right, well, I want to show this next one, and then we'll take more time for questions. So this one here is a different part of Lake Minnewanka. These are different ice cracks, a different time. These ones feel more amorphous. Similar technique. So when I showed that one there with the camera literally resting on the ice, this is the exact same thing that's going on here. So even in the images that are in focus, well, we're going to have things that are out of focus here. So this one here, let me go back to Lightroom to show you what I would do. So I have this one here. No, not this one. Here, 7-image focus stack. So I did the auto focus stack with the D850. This was f/22, 14 millimeter wide angle, ISO 250. I could be at 100. My camera, the 810, the 850 at anywhere between ISO 100 to 640. It doesn't make that much of a difference. It's such a great sensor, high megapixel. So if I can do it at something like that, it's good. I did keep the shutter once again. I actually was following my rule, 2x the focal length. So I'm 1/25th. Remember, I'm not on a tripod or anything else, and everything through. So these are the 7 images. So same process. I would right click, edit in, or go up to edit. And I think you can, I don't remember how to do this. Photo, edit it. Photo, edit in. If you don't like to right click, open as layers in Photoshop, and it'll pull those in for you. So once again, we've done that to minimize disruption. So now we have all these images in here, and we can take a look at them, kind of starting at the bottom. So this is it doesn't matter which order they're in, which is a good, not invariably another question, but you can see this one here. This is where the mountain's in focus. And as I go kind of down through, or I should start at the bottom and go up through, you'll see different parts and what you're seeing. So watch the image. It moves, right? And you think, wow, are you changing your focal length or doing anything else? No, this is what's called focus breathing. And these lenses, and especially the wide angles, are going to breathe as we change that focus point within the image, which is, once again, why we need to align our images. So we're going to go over to edit. We're going to go to auto align. Make sure to auto align your images first for focus stacking. If you don't, everything's going to look really, really off, and all that work you put into your focus stacking is going to be off. So now we're editing. We're auto aligning. And as we're auto aligning, it'll take a second, even with a quick computer. So I'm going to close that workflow. You'll get a copy of that workflow, and then I'll pull up the other one. This is the focus stacking one with the tips and the tricks. So once we're in Photoshop, select them all, edit, auto align, and then we're going to, we don't have to worry anymore about seamless tones and colors. Thank you, Photoshop. And then the next thing we'll do is edit, auto blend, and then we're going to stack the images in that regard. So now it's going through and it's aligning the images. And when it does the actual stacking, it's the really cool stuff. Because you'll see the masking will show you exactly what parts and pieces the program looked at and took a look at. So we've aligned them, which has done absolutely nothing to pull the stacking in. It's still out of focus, but everything is aligned within the image. And so it's compensated for that focus stacking all the way through. So with these all selected, then we go back up here to edit and auto blend. And we're going to select, this is where I actually want to take off seamless tones and colors. So I have it in the wrong spot. One second. So don't select. I'm going to move this down here so it's actually correct. Okay, so it isn't first. So I'm going to take that off. I don't need it to content aware transparent areas. I'm actually going to turn that off. Well, if it did, it would just fill in these areas out there on the side. I'm just going to turn it off for now because I'll either crop it or fix it. But I'm choosing to stack images. So stacking images is going to take all those and then climb together. So now we're going to blend the layers based on content. So we've aligned them. So we have all the focal stuff within the field. Now we're aligning these. Excuse me, we've already aligned them. Now we're going to blend them. And when it's going to blend them, it's going to put them all together in each one of these parts that's in focus. It's going to select that and it's going to create a layer mask on these particular parts of the image. And this is a cool thing I think it does. And so as we look at the image, so we click this mask here so we can hit the Alt or Option key and we can see what each mask is doing. So white, it's pulling in these just definitive parts. So you can see this part of the image right here is focused just on that. So this one here that I took, the camera focused just on this area right here. This area here, kind of the same part, just a little bit higher. This one here, a little bit higher, some little tiny things around the outside. This one here, wow, it's really pulling in the focus right there on the mountains. And then this one here is really pulling the focus in on the clouds all the way through. So those are the 7 images all the way through. And so now we're going to go back to this, turn off the mask, and we're going to stamp the layer. We can do 2 things. What do I tell you to do? I tell you to flatten it, but I'm going to stamp it. So you can flatten the image, but if you flatten an image by going here to flatten or going up to, I think it's under image. I can never remember how to do certain things the long way. Yeah, over here, flatten image under layer. What would happen is it would lose all those adjustments that are down below. So there's 2 ways to do this. One is if we stamp it, which is a command called Windows or Command Option Shift E. It's going to stamp the layer, which keeps everything down below it. But there's really no need to keep what's down there below because we have a 2.9, if we look at this, almost a 3 gigabyte image. So I would flatten this image because I don't need to go back necessarily. You could flatten the image and make any adjustments, but before I flatten the image, and in this scene, it's fine. But going back to the question that was asked earlier, if there was wind, I would tell you if there was wind, I would not flatten this image right away because I would want to check around the areas to make sure what was in focus, that it was capturing things correctly. So if wind was blowing foliage around or whatever else, you'd see all of a sudden something that was really out of focus, potentially within the image. This one, as we zoom around and look at it, I don't see anything that's out of focus. It's done a great job with the exception of this part down here. Remember, I mentioned this is well within inside the focal range of my camera. So it's not going to be able to actually keep that part in focus, but we have enough elements up in the image here. And so now we have that focal part of the image. Everything's in sharp focus. This is almost 200% all the way through, sharp mountains here, et cetera. So it's done what we want it to do from that standpoint. Okay, so I'm going to answer some questions and then I want to demonstrate. We've got about 15 minutes left. I'm going to demonstrate Topaz, and I'm going to also demonstrate a little bit of why we want to be careful of the clarity slider and some other things. And now, so I want to take time for questions if we get to the end. So we got some questions. Okay, so picking up. So the D850, Richard asked, do you set the ISO at 64? No, so it has a base ISO of 64. You can do it. Over practices, I just keep it at 100, but you can set it at 64. And the reason I keep it at 100 is my other camera, which I just sold, my D810 was base ISO of 100. And so the reason I kept that one there is because I would sometimes interchangeably use images I captured with both cameras, et cetera, et cetera. But you can take the ISO to a D850 to 64. So. Great question, Stephen. He says, some say focus stacking is not very good in Photoshop and recommend Helicon Focus. Thoughts? Focus stacking. So I've used Helicon before, and I find it a little bit more cumbersome than what I need. And the reason it's more cumbersome than what I need is Helicon is overkill for a landscape scenario like this. That being said, if you're doing macro type focus stacking or insects or anything that you're taking tons and tons of focuses to really get all these minute macro type details, absolutely Helicon Focus is the way to go. But for grand landscapes, I really like what it does here. It works really well for me, but it's a great question. Okay, what do we have here? Do I find that Photoshop, I think this was on the previous image, but that's fine. Do you find that Photoshop will reach a point of diminishing returns on the number of images to stack? I don't, let me think about that. I don't know the answer yet, but I've seen around 10 as the point in time where it becomes more cumbersome. that I want to use. So my night photography images, if I know I want to print them, I'm oftentimes going to be stacking about 10 images to reduce noise. And I think it's around the point in time you start to see diminishing returns. You're not just going to see. Laura asked, do you not suggest using a filter to protect a telephoto lens? It's such a big investment. Yeah, they're big I totally agree. They're big investments, but there's ways to protect, other ways to protect our cameras besides filters. So the UV filter on a telephoto, I mean, it's going to get, there's an opportunity for more stuff to get in there and disperse. The best way you could protect that is you can get lens hoods that kind of come out a little bit further from the lens. So you're not going to like brush it over and scratch it. So I had a lens hood that attached to the front of my 28-300 and stuck out about 2 inches, which wasn't enough to be seen or vignette, but it gave an extra level of protection within there. So that's definitely one of the ways. If you're comfortable with the UV filter and you're getting what you want in terms of sharpness, then don't change it. I've just had instances, I used to use a UV filter way early on, and I'd have the UV filter fogging, for example, when my regular lens was fine because lens atmospherics, et cetera. But I don't want to be the one to be responsible if that big, beautiful lens of yours gets damaged. So, okay. So good questions. I'm going to jump into Lightroom and then I'll take questions at the end as well. So that next thing I want to show is Topaz. So let's look at this image here. So Topaz has sharpen, gigapixel, and denoise. I want to show sharpen. And sharpen is going to do a couple things. It's going to really sharpen up the textures. And if we look at this image, there's a lot of really great sharpness kind of from the get-go within the image, but it is handheld and it is handheld in very bright, very, very sharp wind. I did a good job on my ISO. So looking up here on the right, ISO 100, which is the base of the Z5, 57 millimeter focal length, which is what I chose, f9, my sharpest part, and then 1/320th of a second. So I wanted a fast shutter. It could have been anything a little bit different, but it's a great shutter speed. I got plenty of light. There's my histogram all the way through, but let's see what Topaz does. And so Topaz really can enhance the sharpness in our images. I've used Topaz on a couple images that were slightly or very out of focus, and it really brought things back into focus much better. So focus on some things is really interesting to look at what these new AI programs can do. So we're going to I'm going to do this differently. I like doing it by pulling it into Photoshop first. And there's a couple reasons. No, Topaz is not with Lightroom. It's a separate add-on. It's a plugin that's a separate thing. It's from Topaz. It's called Topaz Labs, and the sharpen, denoise, et cetera, are added. They work in both Lightroom and Photoshop and standalone as well. So the first step I would do is always duplicate the layer. That way, any changes I make, I can see what's down there. And then I'll go up to plugins. Oh no, sorry, filter, Topaz, sharpen AI. And so it's invoking the plugin, which it's telling us, thank you. And now it's zoomed in more than I want it. And so I'm going to back it off just a hair. Zoom to 50%. I can also move around within the image. Okay, so now we can go into the comparison view. And so I'll make it a little bit lighter. And I got to wait for them to update all the way through. So now it's getting out of focus, very blurry. So it's going to run these different modes. Motion blur, which you can sometimes see. Too soft. It's updating the out of focus normal one. Too soft down here, etc. And what I can do once it's updated is I can toggle on between the before and the after. And you can see, even on an image like this that looks really, really sharp, if we're watching these areas right around here in these rock transitions in particular, and it's more so on this one. Look over here on the left. See how it's just bringing out even more of those kind of transitions within the rocks and the areas all the way through. So it's definitely pulling out more of the detail. And I can zoom around to a couple different areas and kind of check. It's going to re-update what it takes a look at. And so it's going to re-image these things all the way through. So now it's updated here. Well, this one here, it's actually starting to halo a little bit when I look up further, where I can see these little white flecks more so. See these little white flecks, that's haloing. And then over here is good. So what I'm going to let it try to do is make its own determination. I'm going to go back to a single view of what it's suggesting. So it's suggesting out of focus, very blurry. And it's going to update that particular setting. So that's the updated portion within there. And it's doing some good stuff in the bright spots. And this is what I was talking about. Be careful of within your shadows of introducing noise or other artifacting. So it's doing a great job on the brightness portions of the image. And what I'll show you within Topaz to bring some of that focus in is how we can mask it later. So we're going to go on ahead and we'll apply this. So it'll apply the processing of the image. Usually with the faster computers, it'll be done pretty quickly. If it's really bogging down your computer, I've had some horror stories from people that said Topaz is really so much computing power. It's more than their computer can handle, but well, I don't know for sure. So this one is the top one is my Topaz layer. And so now I can zoom in to something like 100% and turn that layer off and on and see. So once again, zooming in and out, what I'm liking or not liking. And it's fascinating to me. Look at this. So this area right here, there's actually part of the glacier that's behind there. And before Topaz, you can't even see the glacier, but it's able to sharpen just enough through the clouds to be able to show more of that glacier. So it does some interesting things within the image. Over here in the background parts, it's blurry, but it's kind of making it, I don't know, maybe a little bit too soft, doing some weird things within the clouds, etc. So there's an opportunity now as we look at this image. Sorry, I'm moving around a little bit. So there's our before, so our after or before, to mask in the effect in the area, only the areas we want it to be. And so if we apply a white mask and then we invert the mask through Command I, well, now it's done absolutely nothing to the image. But remember when I said I maybe just wanted to apply this to some of the brighter parts of the image? Well, now I can do a brush, B for brush, white on black, make my thing a little bit bigger, and brush in the effect. This is where we're starting to get into focus on just the lighter parts of the image, just where I want to sharpen up these rocks in different areas. And so I'm not trying to target the darker parts, not necessarily trying to target the shadows. I'm just wanting to bring out more of the details within the lighter part of the image. And you can see just a crude masking like that kind of all the way through. But as we zoom in, well, if I disabled this mask, you can see I would have this effect up there in the clouds and some of the other areas I don't necessarily want. But with the masking, I've just confined that particular sharpness to the parts of the areas, the parts of the image that I want it to be. So now I've made the image more sharp, brought out some more focus within the image by using something like a program like this. So that's the concept of how we can use Topaz. The other part would be how we could sharpen this image. Remember I said save sharpening for the last. So I'm going to duplicate this layer, create a new layer over here. And this one here, now we want to sharpen this image. So say we're preparing it for print or something else. Well, there's different ways we can sharpen, but the best ones I like are something like you can do smart sharpen. And then we can pick and we can look at a particular part of the image. So something like this, where we want to show more of the details, we can adjust our radiuses, our radii to be for smaller detail items or larger detail items. This is about a 13 by 20 image. So I'm going to want to not go too big. something like a 2, not as 100, and then you can apply 1. So this is going to sharpen the bigger details within the image. And I forgot to duplicate it before I started it. So you're not going to be able to completely see it, but it's sharpening the bigger, grainier details in the image. And if you look here, let me just go back. Let me duplicate this one. All right, so now we'll go back into, and I'll just redo the filter again. So that's the bigger details. And then you can go back into the filter again. Smart sharpen. Same thing, but now I want to do the smaller radiuses, the really finer details within the image, and really get those to kind of contrast through. So I've applied the same filter twice. And now if we look kind of zoomed in, there's our before and there's our after. And so it's done a really nice job of pulling out more of the details, removing some of the lens blur, the fuzziness down within the image. We just look at it in different senses. Once again, if we have an effect sharpening the clouds, we don't want that. We can put a mask on there and take that away, but it's done a fairly good job of making the whole image look a lot sharper. And this is kind of the final piece of focus from the standpoint of, you know, when we get to the final part of our image, well, we can sharpen it as well to really help enhance the clarity of all the good practices we've kind of put in place earlier within the image. So that could be the perfect place to end with taking the time for questions. So any questions that we have to end, we'll take those. And then when we're done with questions, we'll wrap it up. Almost 2 hours, aside from the difficulties with the microphone, actually putting it in front of you, and the stuff with Zoom, which seemed to resolve itself. I think it went pretty well. So, okay. So Doreen asks, how do I find the best ISO for my camera? I have a Nikon D500. I would say probably the best way is to simple Google all the way through, and just simply, if we go over to something like this right here, what is the base IS? I can't see what I'm typing. D500. I can't see what I type. Oh. For my Nikon, and it should tell us right there. So yeah, so then we see our native ISO is 100 to 5120, 200. So that's probably the best way to see it. This is actually directly from Imaging Resources, which you could test, but you could check those. Most of the newer non-entry level cameras, newer as in the last 5 years or so, are 100s. A lot of the more entry level ones are going to be 200, 100 to 200. Some of the newer ones, like the D810, which even the D850, are going to be 64. But it's great. Okay, cool plugin. I know I did great for the learning experience. Glad to hear that, Myra. So, oh, I also said I'd show why clarity isn't a good slider. So let's go back into, I'll start the share again. You're right, I did. So I would do that. So screen share again. Back to this one here. All right, so let's look at this image here, unsharpened as well. So we're back on this image here, and I'll just demonstrate real quick. So if we go into the develop module, which is D, shortcut D, taking this in there, and we go and we look at this one, because the tendency oftentimes is going to be to take, people add a lot of clarity to their images because they think, you know, it's really bringing out a lot of detail. But what's occurring is, as we look at the clarity slider, is it's adding some unnatural contrast. And if we add a little bit too much of it, oftentimes we're going to get really, really magenta shadows. We're going to get a lot of color fringing within our shadows. It's going to come out. So this is kind of the before and the after. Watching our shadows in particular, it's bringing out some unnatural color casts within our images. And so that's the reason clarity can be bad. Images as well around, sometimes around images like this. When we get into areas of transitions, we're going to get some haloing and some fringing. not really seeing it right here, but maybe it's just the camera, good enough light. But in lower light images, if I'm adding too much clarity or texture, I'm going to get a lot more chromatic aberration and fringing. I think I have enough light here, which is good. The way to add it, the way to do it, I'm not saying don't use it at all, but to do it through a local adjustment. So if you want to add some clarity or some texture, those are going to be targeting the midtones. The midtone portion, the midtone contrast is to do it as a brush and then lightly brush it on to different parts of the image, but that's part of what's not today. So, okay. So a couple last questions. I'm going to do I do smart sharpen after topaz sharpen? I haven't determined yet to answer the question completely honestly. Of when and where topaz fits into my workflow. So far, I'm going to do topaz before I do smart sharpen. But so far with topaz, I've only been using it to kind of salvage images that are just really, really borderline, or to bring out particular things within an image. And I'm having to do more and more masking. Topaz as its own product is really, really strong, especially for web-based images, et cetera. How I'm going to incorporate that in when I'm talking about using it as part of my workflow, that's related to prints. And I ordered my first round of test prints using Topaz that'll get here probably tomorrow, or excuse me, later this week. And so I'll be able to look at them and be able to say, I like what I see, or no, this doesn't look quite right. So I'll be able to get back to you on that one. Doreen asked or said, am I going to have any live person workshops this summer? And I'm not this summer, but in the fall, coming up soon. I'll be doing one here in November here on the Central Coast. So people that have taken classes from me before are going to get first access to it. So good stuff. All right. Well, I have a couple things I need to attend to tonight still. So I'm going to sign off for now. You'll get the recording tomorrow, probably midday-ish Eastern Pacific time. So early afternoon, along with the materials. If I forget anything, please make sure to let me know. Otherwise, really appreciate you guys coming out, the support to do these types of classes, and hopefully help to bring things more into focus for you. And with that, I'm going to sign off. So thanks all.